Hello and welcome back to the 5th episode of my Fortnite tutorial series. Today we will wrap up the resource system by adding the functionality for our main widget and finally creating the child class of our abstract resource manager component. In the last episode we already created the resource widget and in our main widget added a box that will contain our 3 resource widgets. However, if we have a look at Fortnite again, when you start building there, you will see a larger version of the resource and the amount that is placed above the shield bar. So let's start with a size box in our main widget, drag it in, and we'll call that current resource box. Make that a variable. Then we'll anchor it to the lower center. Alignment will be 0.5 in X and 1 in Y. We will check size to content, then enable the width and height override, and the size that I decided to use is 160 pixel in width by 70 in height. Then we can set the position in X to 0 and in Y to something like minus 190. So that will be placed close to a shield bar, and in that size box we will have 2 elements. One is the icon of the resource and the second one is the amount text. So to align them horizontally, of course we need a horizontal box. Add that onto our size box, and starting with the icon we want to wrap this by another size box. Drag that in, check width and height override, and let's make our icon 70 pixel in width and height. Then look for an image and drag that onto the size box. We can call that current resource icon, and as a default let's just look for our wood icon underscore wood from the texture spec. Then we can collapse that little size box and add a text onto the horizontal box. Call that current resource amount. Also make it a variable, and horizontally we will align that to the left and vertically to the center. Default can be something like 500, really doesn't matter. Font family will be our Burbank bold font. Bump up the size to something like 45, and to make it stand out just a little bit more we will give this an outline. So under outline settings we will set the outline size to, let's say, 3 pixel of outline, and we will also give it a shadow. So under shadow color double click and bump up the alpha to 1. Alright, you see that vertically it's not really placed at the center. To fix that, let's expand the padding and give it a padding of maybe 5 to the top or 6. Maybe our amount text is just a little bit too close to the icon, so let's fix that by adding a spacer to the horizontal box, and then grab that spacer and drag it just before the current resource amount will be placed between those 2 elements. Then we can give that a size in X of 7 pixel maybe. That's it for everything we have to do on the designer tab. Let's switch over to the graph, and first off let's add a variable, because as I already mentioned in the last episode we will dynamically create the resource widgets, and to keep track of them we will store them in an array. So let's add a variable here, call that resource widget, and for variable type that will be w underscore resource. An object reference, to make it an array we just hit that blue icon and choose the array, then compile and save. We also need a function to generate them, so let's add a function called generate resource widgets, and of course that needs an input because it needs to know how many and which resources to generate, and to pass on that information we will just give it a reference to the resource manager that it should create the widgets for. So under inputs hit the plus, call that manager, and type for that will be a BPC master resource manager object reference. Let's also give it an output because it's supposed to return the widget it has created for us, and the type for that will be w underscore resource again, object reference, and an array that we will just call something like created widgets. To create our resources we first have to get them off of the manager, so look for resources, get resources, then off of it we will get the keys, so all of the resource classes in there. We don't really care about the values, and then we want to run for each loop, because for every found resource class we want to create a widget. Type for that w underscore resource, and it will already be asking you for the resource class because we made that editable and exposed on spawn. That will come from our array element. Hook that up. Also let's store that created widget in our resource widgets array, so we will get that array and add to it, then hook up the return value and connect the execution pins. Now we created the widget, however you wouldn't be able to see it because there is no parent widget yet. So what we need to do is drag in our resource box and then call the function called add child to horizontal box. We'll be asking you for content. That will be the return value of our create node. So now we should be able to see it. However, I told you, and we also see in Fortnite, that there is a little bit of empty space between two resource widgets. Let me quickly go into Designer to show you. So here's a horizontal box. Under user created, let's just drag in 3 resources. And so that there are 10 pixels in between every resource widget, we will select all of the resources except for the first one and apply a padding of 10 pixels to the left. So that looks fine. However, we want to create them dynamically, so we can remove them in here. To give them a padding off of the return value of the add child to horizontal box node, you can look for set padding, then split the padding because we only want to use the left padding. And as I said, the first resource widget doesn't need a padding. In here we have to use a select node, select float, and the boolean that is used for selecting will be that the array index is greater than 0. Connect that to pick A. So if it is greater than 0, we need a padding of 10. If not, there will be no padding, so 0 is fine. Once that loop is completed, we'll go into our return node and hook up the resource widgets to the created widgets. Compile and save. For now, that's it for the main widget. However, we will return to it later, so we will just minimize it. And let's go to blueprints, classes, right click our master resource manager, create child blueprint class, and let's call it bpc underscore player resources and open it up. First off, we need a couple of variables in here. Our component needs to communicate with the player, so it needs a reference to him. Add a variable called player character or player reference. Variable type will be third person character, object reference. As I already said in the stats manager, if you're using the first person template, for example, that would be the first person character. Then we need another variable that will tell us whether that component has yet been initialized. So let's call that initialized question mark, make it a boolean. If you have a closer look at the variable information here, there is a boolean called private. Let's check that. If you're not a programmer already, you probably won't know what private means. So let me explain this really quickly. Private variable is one that can only be accessed from within the class it's created in. So our player resources in that case. That means that you use it for things that are handled internally and also that should not be accessed from other classes. Like in this case, the initialized boolean. Because what could happen potentially if we're doing mistakes as a programmer is that another class tells the resources that it is initialized, though it actually hasn't completed that event yet. So to prevent this from happening, you just make a variable private and handle everything about that variable in that class here. In here we also need the resource widgets. So let's make that a variable, resource widgets. Type for that w underscore resource reference and an array. You can also make that private. And lastly, in Fortnite, there is always one resource that is selected. So the resource that will be used by default when building something. And you can actually change the currently selected resource by hitting the right mouse button in Fortnite. To keep track of what is currently selected, we will add a variable that is called selected resource index that we will make of the type integer, and that will be a single variable, not an array. Also make this private. Compile and save. Then we need a couple of functions. Like I said, the selected resource index will be private because it should not be modified from another class. However, there are cases when other classes want to know about its value. To work around that, you just add a function that you can call something like getSelectedIndex, which will simply return it. To do that, give it an output of type int. Just call that out and hook up the selected resource index, connect that to the out and make that a pure function because it only returns something. Here in the functions, if you have a look at the access specifier, you will also see that there is public, protected and private. Protected basically means that it's hidden for other classes but visible for child classes, just in case you wanted to know. Let's add another helper function called getSelectedResource. Like the name suggests, this function will just return what resource is currently selected. To get that, let's look for a resources variable, get resources, then get the keys of that, and then you've got an array we will get from that and hook up the selected resource index. Then we will add the return node. And actually, if you don't want to hit that little plus icon every time you create a function, you You can also just drag and drop the return value onto the return node and it will automatically do that for you. Let's call that out, hook up the execution and make that a pure function. Apart from that, we want to be able to get a resource widget for a specified resource. So let's add a function called getWidget for resource. That needs one input and two outputs actually. The input will be the resource we're looking for. And the type will be a master resource class reference. Then it will have one output that's just a boolean called success question mark. And the second one will be the widget. So a w underscore resource reference. Just call it widget. This will be another pure function. We just return something. That's why we called that a get function. So check that pure boolean. And to find that widget, we drag in the resource widgets array. And then we will run a for each loop with break. In that series here, we haven't used that node yet. So basically that's just a for each loop with the exception that you can execute logic that will go into that little break execution here. And once that is reached, it will automatically go to completed. And we are using this loop in this case here because if we found a resource widget, we don't want to cycle through all of the other widgets until we go to completed. So just to increase your performance by a bit, we will then break out of the loop. All right, to find the correct widget, off of the array element, we will get the resource that this widget is associated with, and we will check whether that equals our input resource class. Then add a branch. You can speed up the process of adding branches by just holding B and left clicking. Hook that up to the loop body, connect the equation to the condition, and if that's true, we will drag off of the array element here, and then promote to local variable. We can just call that local found or local found widget, whatever you want. Hook that up to true. And as I explained before, after that, we will go back to our loop and into that break node. Once we've completed our loop, we want to check whether the local found widget is valid. So did we find anything or not? And if it is valid, we can go into our return node and return successful with the local found as our widget. If not, just copy over the return node and uncheck the success and don't connect anything to the widget. Then we will add another function called currently selected widget or get currently selected widget. We just get widget for resource and the resource will be get selected resource. Plug in the out for the resource. Then let's add a return node. Drag and drop the widget onto the return node, make it a pure function, and that's it. Then add the next function called select current resource. You might remember that in our resource widget, we set up a function that will highlight a resource to indicate that it was selected. To do that, we just get the currently selected widget and call the select resource function in there. Check the select and ignore check will be left as false. After that, return. Before we continue in here, let's quickly hop back to our main widget because there's a function missing which will handle updating our larger version of the currently selected resource. So in our graph, add a function called update current resource. This also needs an input, and because only our player resource component currently has the functionality of selecting resources, the type of our variable will be a BPC player resources reference that we can just call player resources. And it's not an array, just a single variable. What we've got to do in here is off of our player resources, we want to get the selected resource. The out is the class. So we still have to get class defaults. Then we have access to the resource data, and here we gotta break that. We don't want to worry about the name. We can uncheck that. So we've got the icon here. And to update this, we will get the current resource icon and set brush from texture. Check the match size. Texture will be the icon. Hook that up to the execution. And then we also have to update the amount text, current resource amount that is. Set text. To get that value, first off of our player resources, we want to get resource, and the resource here is the selected resource. Then we want to convert the amount to a text, go into the advanced settings, uncheck use grouping, hook up the return value, and add a return node. Alright, that's it for the main widget. We can close that and return to our player resources. In here, let's quickly go to the event graph and add a custom event that we will call on resource switched. So basically when we select a different one, we won't implement that yet, but now let's add a function called select next resource. First off, we will get the currently selected widget and call the select function, select resource function. The select has to be false, of course. We want to deselect or unselect it basically, so that we can select the next one. Let's get our resources again and get its keys. Hook that up here. After that, we want to set our selected resource index basically to the next one. However, what we're trying to achieve is something like a cycle behavior. So it will go to 0, 1, 2 and then back to 0 again. And to do that, we need to get the last index of our keys. So basically the maximum for a resource index. And we want to get our resource index, check whether that's less than the last index. And off of the boolean here, we will call a select int node. So if that is false, that means we would pick B, and it's only false if our selected index is equal to the last index. And then we want to start all over again, so B will be 0, and A will just be the next one, so our selected index plus 1. Then connect that to the selected resource index, call the select current resource function. Additionally, we also want to update the large version of the icon of the resource in our main widget. So grab your player character, get the main widget, and we will call update current resource. The player resources will just be a reference to ourselves. So type in self and hit enter. And after we did all of that, we will call the event we just created. So on resource switched. Compile and save. That's it for the functions. We can close them and go back to our event graph, because we need another custom event called initialize manager. And let's give that an input of the player. Type here third person character object reference. The first thing we need to check is whether that reference here is valid. And if it is, we can set our internal variable to that. Also, we can then set the initialize to true and start to generate our widgets. So we get the player character, main widget, and then generate resource widgets. Again, the manager is asking for here will be self, and the created widgets will go into our resource widgets variable. So we will set that. After that, let's grab our resources variable, get its keys. Then we want to run a for each loop. And the only thing we want to do here is update the resource display. What this will simply do is when you give your player resources component some default values for the resources, it will also display them on event begin play in our main widget. After that was completed, we can call our select current resource function. Compile and save. The last step here is to update the update resource display function. Currently that doesn't do anything. So under functions, go to override, update resource display, and let's first check whether we are initialized. If not, we can't do anything. And then we have to get widget for resource and plug in the input. Off of the success, let's add another if statement or a branch. Connect it to the true of the first one. And only if both of these branches are true, we can do something. Then we want to grab our widget, get the amount text and set text. And for the text, we first have to get the value. So get resource, hook up the input, convert the amount to a text, to text int. Again, no grouping, plug that in for the int text. So we updated that. Now we have to check whether that resource we updated is the one that is currently selected. If so, we also have to update that currently selected resource box in the main widget. To do that, we simply get the currently or the selected resource, and we will check whether that equals the input resource. If so, we want to grab our player character, then the main widget, and then update current resource. Again, player resource will be self. Alright, compile and save. That's everything for functions, events, and variables in here. The only thing left that could make your lives a little bit easier is to go to your class default and add the 3 default resources to it. So if we hit plus here, we should be able to select the class. There is an engine bug actually. Sometimes the child classes are not displayed. To fix that, you just open up the child classes and compile and save them once. And then we should be able to select them, right? So our first one will be wood, starting at 0. Second one will be stone. And the third one will be metal. Compile, save, and close the player resources. Also close the other resource child classes. Let's attach that component to our player. So open up the third person character, add a component, and it will be a BPC player resources. We also have to initialize that on event begin play. Right here, after we initialized our stats, drag in the BPC player resources, initialize them, and the player will be self. Hook everything up. If we compile and save and play now, you will see that all of our 3 resources are appearing. We've got wood, stone, and metal. And also in the main widget, slightly above our shield bar, you will see a larger version of our wood with the amount. However, right now we can't select anything else. And we also cannot increase or decrease the amount. So let's add some default keys for that. First off, to modify something, we will use the 1, 2, and 3 keys for the 3 different resources. So let's look for 1, for 2, and for 3. Drag in the player resources and add resource. Let's copy that 3 times. Always plug in the BPC player resources as the target, and then we will select wood first, stone and metal. Let's enter a default of 150 for every amount. Compile and save and play. So if I hit 2 now, you will see that it increases to 150. I'll hit that multiple times and we'll bump up to 999, which is our maximum. If we hit 1, it should update both on the right side of the widget and also in the center. Yep, it does that. The key use for selecting another resource in Fortnite is the right mouse button. So let's look for that. Right mouse button. And once that is pressed, just drag in the player resources and call select next resource. Hook that up to the press, compile and save. Let's do a final test here. Currently our wood is selected. I hit 1 and that will update. Now I can select the next one. And if I hit 1 again, that only updates on the right side. But 2 will update that. And if I hit that right mouse button again, we'll go to metal. Can increase that. Hitting the right mouse button once more, we'll go back to the wood. Alright, that's working perfectly. That's it for this episode. In the next one, we will set up different states for the player, so we can check whether he's currently building or fighting and execute different behavior based on that. So, see you in the next episode.